recorded. So we're gonna set up the recording now. Thank you all so much for being here. Welcome to the Program in Criminal Justice Policy and Management's Fall Speaker Series, Criminal Law as a Tool of Authoritarian Control. We are really glad for you to have joined us this afternoon. This is the second event in our series. The first event was with Professor Yanilda Gonzalez, and the recording of that will be available on our website and on YouTube in the weeks to come. You can follow along with the full series on our website here. I'm about to drop the link in the chat. And if you would like to follow along on our YouTube page or catch up with prior events, this is where those videos will be posted. A few ground rules to get us going and how we try to operate this space. So we have switched, as some folks know, from a meeting format to a webinar format this semester, but we try to maintain the sense of community in our space. And so throughout the event, if you have questions that come up, please feel encouraged to drop them in the chat or to use the Q&A function, and we will keep a running log so that you can, at the end of the presentation, or in this case, moderated conversation, unmute and ask your own question of our speaker directly. But again, feel free to share other resources or articles in the chat as we're going. We want this to feel like a rich conversation and encourage that kind of engagement. This is being recorded, as I mentioned, and any shared resources in the chat we will put on our website associated with the event after the fact. So you will be able to access them again. And if you're having trouble accessing anything because it's behind an academic paywall, please don't hesitate to let me know. We'll try to make that available in other ways, if possible. I think that is all of the kind of preliminary housekeeping to do. And so I'd like to start this afternoon with just a little bit of framing before I introduce our speaker. So this particular event, as you all know, is called Policing Borders and the Designation of Enemies Within. And our faculty chair, Sandra Smith, and I conceived of this speaker series months ago, and we entitled this particular one of the events months ago, and it has become eerily prescient in the past couple of weeks. And so just to kind of give us some context and framing for the conversation we're about to have, I'd like to start with two brief clips. And bear with me as I set up the screen so that you all can see these along with me, but just to give us some content for the conversation. Okay, I'm going to play the clip now.
Recent decades did politicians somehow come to believe that our job is to police the far reaches of Kenya and Somalia, while America is under invasion from within. We're under invasion from within.
That's our first clip. The second clip I'd like to show you all is from recent days as well. One more time.
Well, let me also mention that the Border Patrol shouldn't be there either. They're claiming that the shores of Lake Michigan are the border of the United States, and therefore they should be in Chicago. They belong on the borders, truly.
Okay, so just again, for thinking about the two components that we're going to talk about today with our expert scholar, Naomi Roht-Arriaza, who we're delighted to have join us today. The context, of course, of her research has been dramatically focused on Latin America, and we will be speaking about those countries and their historical experiences. But I think the particular political moment in the United States is obviously the backdrop to which we are having these conversations. And given the kind of topical relationship to those particular sets of comments, I just wanted to offer that as some framing to get us going. But now I'd love to introduce you to our speaker. So as I mentioned, Naomi Roht-Arriaza is joining us today. We are delighted to have her here with us. She is the Distinguished Professor of Law Emerita at the University of California College of the Law in San Francisco. She grew up in New York and Latin America, including in Chile, Guatemala, and Costa Rica. She has been a scholar of the law and of human rights for many, many years. She has been an expert on transitional justice, the international legal system, the international human rights regime, and you can read her full bio on our website. And we are so delighted to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So to get us going, I figured we would pick up from where the conversation left off in our previous week's sessions with Professor Gonzalez. And in particular, you know, you have been a scholar of authoritarian states, of transitional justice, of human rights, and we could talk about this starting from the conceptual level. So that conversation included a focus on Brazil and in particular the popularity of punishment there, which may enable the public to endorse or to justify police violence against disfavored individuals. One of the phrases that Yanilde kept bringing up was a popular public conception of a good criminal is a dead criminal. And so one of the final questions from an audience member that arose was whether research had kind of probed whether there was evidence that people supported punishment more when the particular targets of that punishment were immigrants versus citizens. And I think that question opens up a huge terrain for exploring how leaders define these in-groups and out-groups with respect to immigration status, ethnicity, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, geography, any other kinds of relevant markers of identity and circumstance. So I wonder if you could start for us, based on your research, about how common this is as governments shift into these more authoritarian regimes. How do these regimes define in-groups and out-groups? How common is it for criminalization to be part of that process of defining these groups? And to what extent does that fracturing of society into virtuous citizens versus kind of deserving targets of punishment or security threats enable that erosion of democratic norms?
It's a huge question, but let me start with two different moments in Latin America.
Yes.
And I think what let me start by saying authoritarian governments, dictatorships always find in-groups and out-groups. Part of the way this works is by creating an out-group, marginalizing the out-group, and then dehumanizing the out-group. That's how these processes work. And we can see this happen in Latin America during the 1970s, which was the time of military-led or military dictatorships. At that point, the outgroup was political opponents. And political opponents defined first as people who were willing to take up arms against the government, but pretty soon after expanded to their families, their friends, anyone who was working in a poor neighborhood, anyone who was trying to bring some kind of social services, water, education, whatever, to poor neighborhoods. And so you see that, you start with the thin edge of the wedge, but it never stays there. It always expands. And then the second point is always these people aren't really human, right? And you can go back to the Holocaust, you can go back to Rwanda, you can go back to any of the places where these processes have ended in massive violations of human rights. There's always a dehumanization component, right? And one of the things that makes the current moment so dangerous and so scary is that we see that dehumanization process happening almost in front of our eyes. In the wake of the return to elected governments in Latin America, there was another kind of debate about good victims versus bad victims. And I wanted to spend a moment there. There were processes of, for example, in Peru, of redoing trials that everybody understood had been done in a very biased way without any rule of law. But there was a debate about whether people who had been involved in organizations that had taken up arms were deserving victims or not. right? And so there was this kind of, well, there's innocence, and of course we should take care of the innocence, but then there's the not so innocence. Um, and the fact that those people had been thrown in jail with no rule of law, with no due process, with no nothing, kind of got swept aside in that, these are not nice people. So there's that kind of dynamic that happens, right? Where the point that everybody deserves due process, that everybody deserves rule of law. And if you think someone has broken the law, you should deal with it within the law, right? That point gets lost in favor of, the innocence versus the not so innocence. Now we're in a third moment in Latin America. Um, and we're seeing gang membership used in exactly the same way. Now, there is, as there usually is in these things, a kernel of truth here, right? I mean, gang violence in many countries in Latin America is a real problem. And I don't want to minimize it. It affects people's lives. It affects the way they go about their business. People are extorted. People can't walk around at night. Their businesses are subject to protection rackets, etc. That's all real, right? But what we're seeing is that the way in which authoritarian regimes are dealing with it doesn't stop with gang members, right? It's expanded basically to anyone who is young and poor, right? And especially young, poor, and male. Young, poor, male, and living in certain areas that have been the subject of gang violence. Um, and along with that, and necessarily along with that, is the criminalization of defenders of human rights, right? And when I say human rights, I mean that broadly to include anti-corruption defenders, environmental defenders, land defenders, um, anyone who gets in the way of what an authoritarian government wants to do is, of course, characterized as a gang sympathizer, right? Yeah. And that then permits the state to act in ways that it otherwise couldn't justify.
Absolutely. So that's a perfect transition to where I want to go from here, which is to think about the specific kind of case study of what's been happening in El Salvador. And you wrote this excellent piece in Just Security a few months ago, which I will share below in the chat if folks haven't had a chance to take a look, kind of looking at El Salvador as sort of a blueprint for where things could go in the United States and sort of where authoritarian regimes are generally going. And one of the kind of pieces that's core to this analysis is the kind of implementation of a particular form of martial law, right, that focused on use of gang labels and illegal association charges in this project of massive expanded detention, often indefinite pretrial detention. And so I'm hoping that you can tell us a little bit more about how the Bukele administration created and implemented this particular legal regime, and in particular, kind of like what were the network of changes and how are people even identified as gang members? You gave us a teaser of that just now, right? And sort of saying that the kind of it's sort of an ideological framing as much as it is rooted in fact, although there is this real felt and true sense of insecurity in communities that you also talked about. So I wonder if you could give us a little more context for what does this really look like and how it's playing out and the focus on gang membership, so to speak.
Sure. So, okay, so to go back a couple of decades, the gang problem in El Salvador started in LA, which is kind of ironic at this point. But because in the late 1970s, early 1980s, there was what became kind of a civil war in El Salvador with armed insurgents trying to overthrow a military-backed government. That resulted in some 75,000 people being killed over the course of a couple of years, thousands of people being disappeared, and most relevantly, thousands, tens of thousands of people leaving the country and moving to the US to seek asylum. The children of those folks um, some of them got into the criminal justice system, starting as a sort of self-defense mechanism against other jailhouse mafias. They formed into gangs. The two most well-known are MS-13 and Barrio 18. Uh, so those people were then deported under the Clinton administration back to El Salvador. And those gang structures continued to exist and grew, and basically took the form of extortion, especially of transportation companies, um, small businesses, professionals, and eventually larger businesses in El Salvador. They were never big players in the international drug trafficking market, but they did control local illegal businesses. Um, and pretty much every recent government in El Salvador has tried to negotiate with the gangs, including Bukele. And the idea is, you get your people to vote for us. Um, and we in turn will give you certain prison benefits, will turn the other way to, sort of not look at certain things, right? And those kinds of deals, it wasn't just Bukele, the governments before him tried to do the same thing. When Bukele came in, he tried to do that as well. Looked like it was working for a while. Then there was an upsurge in violence, and Bukele responded with a crackdown. And that involved the imposition of a state of emergency. The state of emergency under Salvadoran law has to be passed by the legislature every 30 days. It's intended as an emergency, right? We've now been over 3 years where every month the legislature revives the state of emergency. Now, what does it mean? It suspends the right to information about arrests, both to the arrested person and to anyone else. Um, it suspends the right to be free of self-incrimination. So, forced confessions. It suspends the right of access to an attorney and to the privacy of communications. So what does that mean? It means that families have no idea where people are once they're sucked into the criminal justice system. The people who are arrested have no way of communicating either with their lawyer or with their family. And the families, you can see them outside the prisons every morning trying to get information about where their loved one is, right? Now, one of the things that happens is that creates a huge system of corruption because people will pay for information about their family members. They will pay to make sure their family member is actually being fed. They will pay to get their family member into a less abusive environment. And people know that. And so, the people who are running the system are raking it in. There is a huge problem at this point. Now, along with the state of exception come a whole suite of other things, right? There's a 2022 law that allows indefinite pretrial detention as long as you're accused of a gang-related offense. And so, of course, everybody is accused of a gang-related offense. There's no bail. Juveniles are allowed to be tried as adults. There's no habeas corpus because the Constitutional Court has said basically they don't have the power to challenge government detention determinations, which is actually not true under the Salvadoran Constitution. But as I'll come back to in a little while, there's a reason why that happened. There are, as of 2023, specialized courts that are supposed to be trying gang members that include so-called faceless judges, in other words, judges that wear masks, supposedly for their own protection to protect against doxing, etc., and threats against their lives. There are the possibility in the law of creating mega trials where you have, hundreds and hundreds of people tried collectively with no individualized defense and no individualized proof required. So there's a whole system now of criminal justice that's been specifically aimed at gang membership. Now, what happens with this? So, like I said, there's a real problem with gangs, right? And so some of the people who have been picked up are gang members, right? And some of them have done pretty awful things. I don't want to minimize that. It was really scary to wander around El Salvador a few years ago, right? There were places you could not go after dark. There were places you could not go at all, right? And so people have generally supported what Bukele has done in making the country safer, right? But, and I think this is sort of inevitable to these systems, there's no good way to do this on the massive scale that Bukele wanted to do it on, with the speed that he wanted to do it with, and not sweep up a whole bunch of people that should not have been swept up. And that is in effect what's happened. You get different percentages as to how many people are supposed to be innocent. What we know is that about 10% are eventually let go. Most of those are provisionally released, so they can be rearrested at any time, but 10%. And we think, the groups that have been trying to follow this are now saying about 40%. There is absolutely no evidence. And the families have all of this proof that, they were gainfully employed, they lived at home, they lived with mom, whatever, right? How does this happen? Well, how do people get arrested? They get arrested on the basis of a hotline, right? You call a hotline anonymously, and you say this person is a gang member, and police go and pick them up. So somebody you had a fight with, somebody who's sleeping with your girlfriend, somebody who wants whose land you want, right? All kinds of reasons go into that. Somebody who has a file at police headquarters that they've been previously involved in crimes. But what investigators were told is that those are made up on the spot and they just backdate it. So it's not a useful way of getting at these things. There are quotas. And let me, if I could rant for just a second about quotas. Whenever you have arrest quotas, you will get abuses, because the fundamental goal is to meet the quota, not to decide where there's evidence and where there isn't. So we see this in El Salvador. In Colombia, there was a huge scandal because the military were given a quota to come up with dead gorillas. And so what did they do? They kidnapped poor young men, took them to the outskirts of town, shot them in the head, dressed them up as gorillas, and said, look, we've met our quota, right? Anytime you have quotas, you will get abuses, right? There's no way to avoid it. And so, just to kind of, in case you haven't noticed, we have this problem too. But there's a lot of bad history in other places about the use of quotas in law enforcement. It never goes well.
Such an important point. I'm dropping in the chat for a domestic take on that, a study by the Brennan Center for Justice on how police quotas really incentivize bad behavior and impede public safety, ultimately, right, if that's the goal of law enforcement. But I wanted to, before we kind of move on to the next question, I just wanted to tease out some of the things that you said and think through. Again, part of our thinking is how can we learn from the history of other places, or the present of other places, in terms of what's happening here in the US. And the notion of mass trials in the criminal context, already in the US, we've been seeing that in the immigration context for years and years and years, particularly near the southern border, right? That there is no individualized due process, that there are these mass hearings that happen in immigration enforcement and deportation cases, thinking about indefinite pretrial detention on the basis of you're not seeing the links. Okay, sorry. I think part of that is a user error on my part. I think I'm sending them just to the hosts and panelists. So let me drop the links again as we're going, but I'll go back and backfill once you're speaking again, Naomi. I apologize to the attendees. Thank you for chatting it up. But again, to that point about indefinite pretrial detention on the basis of allegations of gang membership, we see that in the criminal context in the US already, depending on the nature of the charges, that people can be detained on kind of alleged dangerousness, even if there hasn't been evidence adduced in court on the basis of kind of probable cause. And sometimes those cases go away, or folks can go watch a event we hosted a couple of semesters ago with Professor Babe Howell, who talked about the Bronx 120 takedown in New York City of a supposed federal gang enforcement action where fully a third of people had really no gang ties at all whatsoever, right? So already we're seeing in the US that there are these existing frameworks in the justice system that kind of have a map onto which this additional kind of control could be adopted, right? And I think that that's important for us to think about in terms of what does it look like to confront these then authoritarian turns when you've got an existing infrastructure and bureaucracy that allows for some of this in sort of lighter forms already. I really appreciate you drawing out those themes for us, and also the kind of speciousness of gang labels is another thing that I think in the US context too, we see that people are labeled gang members because of being in photographs with other people who the police have decided are gang members, or wearing certain sports teams logos, or wearing certain colors, and that sometimes that is a true indicia of membership in a violent organization, and sometimes it is somebody who's with their cousin and just hanging out on the street, right? And that there can be that bleed already in the existing frameworks that we see here. So in
tattoos.
Right, absolutely, tattoos. Right,
yeah,
another one that we're seeing now, right? And that was, addressed as being a way to identify people in the Tren de Aragua gang in Venezuela, in the move of people through U.S. immigration enforcement to the Bukele prison. And in fact, the experts on that gang say that tattoos are not a reliable marker of identity in that gang, right? So again, these kind of mutable factors that then can be used as designation, but may not actually be reliable. So you spoke a little bit about already kind of what this means for families that have loved ones charged with illegal association, not being able to find their family members. But I think it would be helpful too to think about what kinds of broader violations of human rights people are experiencing, and how does this build on sort of typical conceptions of rights deprivations experienced by people in incarceration and detention, even in democratic societies. And so, you've been a human rights scholar for so many decades now that that framework is so helpful for us, I think, in trying to understand in a new way how does an authoritarian turn use criminalization and atop kind of baseline rights deprivations.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways in which you can see how these processes end up with severe deprivations of human rights. One, and I'll probably say this several times in the course of the hour, is the blurring of the line between policing and military action. Right. And we see this over and over again in all of these societies. There's a problem with crime. And I think your guest last time talked about this in Brazil. Brazil is another one of the places where there's a problem with crime. And it's not fake, it's real, right? But the easiest way to deal with it for authoritarian states is not to beef up the police, beef up police training, beef up community policing, which are the kinds of things that seem to work. Rather, what they tend to do is to turn it over to the military. In part because it's a justification for building up military budgets in peacetime, in part because these governments need the support of the military And they come out of traditions where the military has been the arbiter of, sort of political survival for years, right? So that's one thing. And human rights law says you're not supposed to do that, right? You're supposed to try to keep these two things. They have separate missions, they have separate ethoses, they have separate ways of dealing with civilian populations and separate rules, right? And once you mush those together, it becomes very, very difficult to figure out what exactly the rules are, right? So that's one thing. Second thing, detention conditions. So detention conditions are under human rights law. You're allowed to detain people. You're allowed to keep them even for long periods of time, but you're supposed to, within the confines of that, they're detained, right? They're in jail. You're supposed to treat them humanely. And one of the things we're seeing in these recent processes is that being inhumane is the point, right? Being inhumane is not just about, oh, we don't have the resources, so yeah, there's overcrowding in the prison, but we're a poor country, we don't have the budget. That's not what's going on. What you've got here is a deliberate attempt to be inhumane as part of a process of dehumanization of the people who are detained, right? And there are a whole set of standard minimum rules about the treatment of prisoners. There are a whole bunch of international instruments that tell you how you're supposed to deal with detainees. The point in El Salvador, as you've probably seen, is to treat people as harshly as you possibly can. One of the kind of I don't want to say silver lining, but one of the things that the recent um, sending of hundreds of Venezuelans to El Salvador and then having them released has done is that it gives us stories from inside the prisons of what the conditions are, which we were not getting because, of course, as I said before, nobody gets to talk, right? Nobody gets out. Um, and they describe beatings every day. They describe people not being given food. They describe, incredible amounts of overcrowding. Um, there are more than 400 people who have been killed or have died of lack of medical care, sometimes as a result of beatings. Um, so, but I think for me, the larger point is being inhumane is the point, right? And then the last piece of that I'll talk about is the question of disappearances. So in the 1970s, one of the ways that dictatorial governments around the world dealt with political opponents was rather than throwing them in jail or assassinating them, they simply picked them up and then refused to say anything about where they were, whether they were being held and where they were being, right? And this is a really horrible thing to do, not only to the person who is detained, but to their family, because the family never knows if they're alive or dead. The family doesn't know if they should mourn them or if they should keep looking for them, right? And this creates all kinds of trauma to the extent that several human rights courts have found that the effect on the families of forced disappearances constitutes torture in and of itself, right? Um, Now, there are different kinds of disappearances. Some disappearances, what happens is the person is picked up, tortured, killed, and the body is thrown into the sea, right? But some disappearances are temporary, right? So the person does eventually show up somewhere, right? Um, but the elements of a disappearance are that it's done by or with the acquiescence of state parties, right, of a state um, agency of some sort, right? The person is detained and there's no acknowledgement of the detention, right? And that's what we're seeing, right? We're seeing in El Salvador. Where are we seeing it here, right? Where people are picked up by ICE and nobody hears from them for 3 weeks. Um, What is that? Right? Yeah. And the lawyer can't get any information. The family can't get any information. The person has no ability to call anyone. Um, so that's the other issue, is whether or not there's an actual treaty on enforced disappearances that spells out the obligations of states. You will not be surprised to know the US is not a party to that treaty. But lots of other states, including El Salvador.
Yeah, and for folks who may not know, and this is, the fact that the US is not a party to the treaty, right, means that it can't be enforced against the United States in any international body. And also it's not been adopted domestically in US law. And in fact, the US has a history of exceptionalism to international human rights treaties, right? The very few that we have adopted, like the Convention Against Torture overall, we tend to take an exceptionalist approach to international human rights enforcement. So the other piece of this then, beyond the kind of expansion of powers and militarization of the criminal processes and reduction of rights protections that are core to democratic societies like habeas corpus or limits on pretrial detention or things like that, you also talk about the erosion of other democratic institutions and kind of societal, civic society institutions generally. So could you give us a little bit of explainer on that as well? What does it look like now in El Salvador in terms of how the administration has targeted the judiciary, the press, other independent agencies?
Sure. So, I mean, there is a kind of, as many people have said, there is a kind of playbook for how this goes. And El Salvador is no exception. So, the judiciary. So, starting even before the state of exception, one of the first things Bukele did when he got a majority in the legislature was to remove the judges from the constitutional chamber who had been duly appointed and appoint his own loyalists to that chamber. Same thing with the attorney general, replaced by a loyalist. There was a civil service reform of the judiciary that basically forcibly retired anyone who was over the age of 60 or had more than 35 years in the service. And that included most of the judges who had been independent, and the ones who had been in charge of major corruption or human rights related trials. It also put the judges under the control of the Supreme Court so that if they ever ruled against what the Supreme Court wanted them to do, they could be fired or sent to the, back end of nowhere without any recourse. So that's in terms of the judiciary. In terms of other agencies, so the Human Rights Ombudsman's Office, the Auditor's Office, the Access to Information, the sort of FOIA equivalent agency, were all taken over by by basically the party of the government. There was a process of gerrymandering where they went from 262 municipalities down to 44, and the way those 44 districts were drawn resulted in 43 of them being controlled by the ruling party or its allies in Congress. In terms of the press, most of the sort of written press has been aligned with the government. The independent press has been largely online, and those folks have been threatened, harassed, surveilled. Pretty much all the independent press at this point has left the country and is reporting from outside. Anti-corruption campaigners and land defenders have been jailed on charges that have not been released to the public, or to the extent they have been released to the public, they make no sense. There's no possible way this could have happened. And yet people are held incommunicado. Most of the NGOs that have been dealing with human rights have also now left the country and are working from outside. And finally, as in many of these situations, there is an NGO financing and control law that attempts to break the relationship between outside funding and non-governmental organizations. And since there is neither a tax code nor any tradition of sort of domestic giving, that's basically the budget. And so a lot of NGOs have had to close. So it's all of a piece. It's not just the criminal justice system. You have to look at the whole piece. And it's a little, it's scary to be
Well,
honest.
and I think that's also useful in thinking about, again, how that rhetorical framing about enemies within and, illegal association, right? That it is both formalized in specific criminalization and also expressed in broader policies, right? By targeting NGOs, by targeting other groups that might have independent streaks or independent mandates to engage in oversight in some form. And I think that leads us nicely into your new book. And I'd love to pivot to talking about this idea of grand corruption. You've I'm going to drop a link in the chat to the book published by Cambridge University Press, Fighting Grand Corruption.
Commercial interlude.
Yes, that's right. But I think that there's so much richness in this text, and I really loved digging into it. But I think if we could start with some defining of terms. You wrote the book after studying what countries coming out of dictatorship or armed conflict have done to avoid it happening again. And that includes traditional processes of transitional justice, right? Thinking about truth commissions and processes of repair and memory. But before we get into those kind of specifics, I think, can you tell us more about what you mean by grand corruption? How does it help us understand who is victimized by state practices like this and how countries are hampered in their transitions towards democracy or towards regimes that respect human rights?
Yeah. So the reason I got into this was out of two reasons. One, I got very frustrated with working on transitional justice in a lot of countries and finding that pretty much anything we were trying to do was being swamped by the takeovers of judiciaries, by corrupt forces, the sort of widespread impunity that often wasn't even about human rights. It was about stopping corruption investigations. But what it did was make it impossible to bring cases around human rights. And so I started looking at this, and one of the things I found is that, when we think about corruption, we think about, yeah, you bribe the cop, you bribe the electrical company so that they give you the permit, even though they probably shouldn't, right? This is not that. This is the whole scale takeover of governments by a kind of combination, and it varies in different places what this combination looks like, but it's basically corrupt government officials, organized crime, and elites, right? Sort of members of the elite. So, bankers, people who facilitate the finance, et cetera, who are basically turning the whole structure of the state to an apparatus that will serve private enrichment, right? And when I say private, I don't just mean you get your yacht. I also mean the financing of political parties, right? To perpetuate themselves in power, right? So, oftentimes we see a combination of the two. You get the yacht, but you also get the financing of the political party, right? Um, and this goes hand in hand with autocracy because the only way you can maintain this kind of siphoning of wealth up into this small group at the top, right, is by clamping down on civil liberties, is by not allowing protest, is by not worrying about things like health and education and housing and other public goods, right, which are almost always one of the juiciest places where illicit enrichment happens. The other one is natural resources. So when you think about how economies are run on, illegal mining, illegal logging, illegal fishing, et cetera, right? Where does that money go? Who gets paid off? And it's not just paid off to approve the project, it's paid off to change the law to make it easier, right? And it's paid off paying off the judge so that if there ever is a case about this, it goes nowhere, right? So it becomes this whole system. And it ends up affecting every single human right you could possibly think of, right? So, economic rights, education, the school doesn't get built, the hospital doesn't get built. Civil and political rights, the judiciary doesn't work right, elections don't work right. Freedom of expression, the press is bought off, right? And so that's the other reason I started getting into this, because as a human rights person, we've been talking about what the link between corruption and human rights is. And I wanted to get some sense of, well, okay, if we posit that there is a link between corruption and human rights, so what? What does it mean? What do you do differently once you know this, right? And so that's what the book is about.
Yeah, and so, one of the kind of early chapters talks about how this was a feature of some of the notorious human rights related cases involving systemic state violence also, that those regimes that engaged in mass killings or mass disappearances, Pinochet in Chile or experiences in Peru and Argentina, like that these also had elements of systemic corruption. So I wondered if you could help us understand too, what is the relationship between those forms of state violence and this kind of systemic corruption? How do authoritarian leaders use them in tandem? Are they targeting the same populations as victims, or are they targeting different victims? Those kinds of things.
So I think that the most obvious link here is impunity, right? So both massive human rights violations like killings, disappearances, torture, and massive stealing, right, from the public purse require that you get away with it, right? And that the powerful are able to get away with it no matter what. And I think that's one of the things that brings the two together, right? Because if you can control the judiciary, you can control both prosecutions for human rights and prosecutions for corruption. And conversely, where there have been trials in Latin America around massive human rights violations, sooner or later, it turns out that those same people were also stealing the country blind. The example I love is Pinochet, because Pinochet was always seen as, well, yeah, he did bad things, he killed some people, but he was an honest military guy, right? Well, turns out that a couple years after trials started on human rights cases in Chile, there was a completely unconnected investigation in the US Senate about support for corrupt actors. And in that investigation against a bank called the Riggs Bank, investigators found that Pinochet had stashed $13 million in one account, $4 million in another account, $50 million in another account, all set up for him and his family members by Riggs Bank. And, so the honest military guy, not so much. But you can find that if you look at the Fujimori Montesinos government in Peru. In other places like El Salvador, Guatemala, Argentina, what you find is that the military guys who were torturing and killing dissidents were also extorting their families to get, money and property out of them in exchange for not killing people, which they never actually did, but that was what they told the families. And then using that money to start businesses that they then use to contract with the state, right? So, there's lots of ways in which these things meet. And I guess the other one I would say is corruption kills, right? I mean, there are all kinds of examples directly when there are protests against corruption that are attacked, indirectly through, sort of lack of services, lack of health care, et cetera. Indirect, I guess directly, really, with collaboration with organized crime, right? Which we see in places like Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, right? The paramilitary, parapoliticians, right? In Colombia is a great example. And these collaborations are intended to control population, to control territory, and anybody who doesn't let themselves be controlled becomes an enemy of the state, an internal enemy, to coin a phrase, and yeah, and is treated accordingly.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I know you have more to say about the relationship with organized crime. I want to just remind folks that they can put questions in the chat and the Q&A. We do have a couple of questions already percolating there. So I think I'm going to pause on my questions for now, though we have many more we could ask, and start letting some folks in the audience ask and engage. So the way that this is going to work, I can see your names, and I'm going to ask you to unmute if you'd like to ask your own question. Our first questioner is Angela. I am allowing you to talk, and then you can unmute and ask your question.
Hi, great. Thank you so much for this informative talk, and I'm excited to take a look at your book. My question, which is in the chat, is typically greater severity of punishment doesn't equate to greater deterrence. So I'm wondering if that was the case in El Salvador, or we have in fact seen crime rates or gang affiliation go down. And then also, do you have any suggestions for Bukele or any other type of leader who experiences these spikes in violent crime on how to deal with it in a way that avoids wrongful incarcerations? Thanks again.
So on the severity point, yes, the level of violence perpetuated by gangs in El Salvador has gone down, right? Has gone down significantly. It's not clear how much of that is driven by agreements with gang leadership, which has by and large been treated much less severely than the rank and file has been. In several cases, the Bukele government allowed gang leaders to leave the country surreptitiously. One of them was then picked up in Mexico. So it's not clear how much of this is that people are physically incapacitated. In other words, the people who would commit crimes are now sitting in these prisons. How much of it is a deal, right, to get better treatment in exchange for lowering the level of violence, right? How much of it is disarticulation of structures, right? So, so I'm not sure I would link it to severity of punishment. It may just be that the sheer number of people involved, right, is what's leading to the decline in the amount of violence. It's about 2% of the population that is now jailed. That's a lot of people. In terms of what you could do, well, I mean, the problem is anytime you have these massive programs, the more due process you incorporate, the longer everything takes. And if you're a government leader, you need to move quickly, right? But for example, there is no attempt to strengthen police forces in El Salvador, right? There's no attempt to incorporate community policing elements. There's no attempt to create a mechanism by which people can contest their incarceration, right? You can have documentation from here till the cows come home that you could not possibly have been involved in whatever you are being accused of being involved in, and nobody cares, right? So there's, there are a number of fairly straightforward things that could be done, one of the problems Bukele is facing now is what's the end game, right? Are you just going to leave these people, all 2% of the population sitting in jail until they all die of old age, right? What what do you do with them, right? Most of them have not been tried. There are, a few trials going on, but not many. So it's not clear how sustainable this is. And I guess the last thing I'll say about this is that as long as there's no alternative source of livelihood, right? Part of the reason people get involved in this is because there's nothing else, right? Um, and Bukele has been trying to create alternative sources of livelihood, but so far I haven't seen it work. So, that's the other issue. Put more energy into that.
Thank you. Next up, Daniela is our questioner. Daniela, I'm allowing you to talk and you are welcome to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. It's been super insightful. And I'm writing my senior thesis actually on the 2009 coup in Honduras. And I thought my question, and also like the effects of it on like tolerance, on corruption. But this made me curious specifically about, you mentioned Salvadorans have generally supported what Bukele is doing, especially his mano dura policies. And despite the suspension of basic legal protections and procedures towards the citizens, to what extent do you think Salvadoran citizens are willing to tolerate this violation of rights in exchange for public safety, for example? And do you think this tolerance should be a concern? Or, I don't know, like, do you have any thoughts on that? Very curious to hear what you say.
So far, Bukele's approval ratings in polls are very high, right? They're in the 70s, 60s, 70s. They're coming down, right? As this drags on and as, more and more people know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who has been sucked into the system. But it does seem that, well, there was one other element that I didn't mention when I was talking about the sort of conditions, and that is the control over information and the amount of disinformation that circulates, not only from social media, but there are fairly large bot operations that are, pushing out the Bukele line constantly. And that has sucked up a lot of the social media as well as traditional media spaces. And so, when you ask what's people's tolerance, it kind of has to do with what they think they know. And I think it changes as more and more people are swept up in these operations, um, and more people know someone personally, right? Because you're not going to find it any other way. And it goes back to where we started the conversation, is the other thing, and that's the dehumanization issue, right? It's perfectly fine to keep these guys in jail forever as long as they're a bunch of, nasty vermin and they're all guilty by definition, right? It's only when it becomes clear that, well, maybe not all of them, right? Maybe not most of them. That's when you start finding lower levels of tolerance. But it has been quite, to me, it's been quite surprising how long there's been this high level of tolerance for what Bukele is doing, right? I mean, I sort of understood it a year ago or 2 years ago, but what's been interesting is how long it's endured.
Thank you for that. The next question in the chat is coming from Hey Yun. I'm going to allow you to talk and you can unmute and ask your question.
Hi, hello, can you hear me? Yeah, I was just curious about as to what your thoughts were on usage of various types of data and data analysis to provide human rights advocates and activists to mitigate or bring to justice human rights violations around the world. I asked this because you also sit on the advisory board for the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. So that was my question. Thank you.
Yes, statisticians for human rights. It's a great thing. So one of the things we see when authoritarian governments come into power is that one of the first things they do is they close down sources of data, right? So to go back to El Salvador, because it's just a wonderful case study, one of the first things they did was to close down the Institute for Access to Information, right? And then to put it under Bukele's control. So pretty much everything is now reserved and you can't get data on it. So you can't get data on public contracts. You can't get data on prisons. You can't get data on anything related to the state of emergency. You can't get data on tax policy. So, one of the things they're trying to do is to make it impossible for you to know what's actually going on because there's no data there. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that data can be very important for two reasons. And this goes into what HR DAG does and what a number of other groups like this do. One is extrapolating from what we know to what we don't know. So when people are killed in large numbers, we know something about how many bodies showed up, how many names are on a list, how many family members come forward. But what we don't know is how many family members are no longer alive to come forward, right? How many people in the village, the whole village was killed. And so there's nobody to come forward and say, these were the people who were killed. How do we fill that gap? And that's one of the things that statistics can do, right? We can also figure out who's being discriminated against, right? One of the things that the group that I work with did was testify in a genocide trial that the odds of these people being randomly chosen on the basis of something other than ethnicity were pretty close to zero, right? And that therefore the intent was there. On police violence, right? One of the interesting things that you can do is you can use statistics to figure out, sort of how many things are not being reported, right? That police are doing. So I think it's a really important area, and I would urge any of you that have a background in statistics, yes, we need you. The human rights movement desperately needs people who can do that kind of work.
Thank you for that. Our next questioner is Emerson Martinez Ferreira. Would you like to unmute and ask your question? Emerson, are you able to unmute? If not, I'm happy to ask the question on your behalf. Yes, it looks like yes.
Vocês me escutam?
Yes, we can hear you.
Certo. Eu não sei se em inglês ou português, embora eu falo português.
Não, português é muito bom. Eu prefiro em inglês.
Olha, mas acredito que na legenda vai em inglês, é isso?
I can read it for you in English if that's better. So the question is, what is the role and responsibility of communication in sustaining selective criminalization and the political use of fear, which perpetuate authoritarian practices disguised as justice and public security? Thank you for the question, Emerson.
Yeah,
Agradeço.
yes. Communication is absolutely key. And the question is, how do we break through these, sort of concerted campaigns that make it very, very difficult for independent sources of information to break through what are basically media boycotts, right? I mean, we're seeing now in the US all, the sort of concentration of media in the hands of people like David Ellison, people who have, sort of very close ties to the current government. Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post deciding that they're going to be quote unquote neutral. All of those things are part of the fight for communication, right? The fight for what the narrative is. I think one of the things that I've found in the corruption space that has been useful is talking about what are the effects on real people of these things, right? And this is not new, we know this, but being able to say, look, yeah, they stole the money, but that's not just about, everybody does it and that's just the way the world works and all politicians are crooked. It's about these people died because they couldn't get medical care, right? These children, as there's an actual case in Peru right now, these children were poisoned because the school lunch program ended up buying rotten food, right? Because it was a whole lot cheaper and stealing the difference, right? So, can we begin to talk about these processes, not so much as abstract processes, but connecting up the ways in which the authoritarian tendencies of the system have real impacts on real people.
Yeah, and that's such an important point, and also, supported by a robust literature also that what moves people is human stories rather than data often, right? And not to suggest that data isn't important, as you've already explained for our audience, that it's critically important often, and particularly in places like courts, which need evidence in order to render their decisions. But I think you're right that in the realm of communications and public opinion, that talking about the true human impacts of this is critical. I think it might be nice for us to end on a note of hope. And so I wonder if, and that may feel challenging in this moment, but you talked about the experience of El Salvador, sort of a warning for the United States, but I think that warning also may, lead us to certain lessons for understanding how leaders and communities that are committed to protecting and promoting human rights can respond or can anticipate what's coming next. And so I wonder if we could sort of flip that warning on its head, and if you have any insights to share about, how to respond when these kinds of trends are starting to be implemented.
I think there's a couple of things. One is, it's gonna sound trite, but it's really true. It's the unification and the sort of ability to work together of people who are fundamentally interested in similar, although different things. So human rights groups, environmental groups, family members of disappeared, family members of people who are in jail, people working on land issues, coming together to say, there's a similar root to all of what is happening here, and we need to combat it together. And I see that starting to happen to some extent in the anti-corruption, environmental, and human rights spaces, right? Where it turns out it's the same problem, right? It's the same group of people that are at, sort of the root of all of this. But there needs to be more of it, sort of what people talk about sometimes as breaking down silos, right? I think that's something that's really important. I think using all the different possible areas of pressure, so the courts, but not only the courts. One of the things that I write about in the anti-corruption space is the pushing on courts to allow people who have been victims of corruption to intervene in court cases directly. Because what we find in a lot of places, you saw this if you watched TV yesterday, prosecutors can be politicized, right? And prosecutors cannot do a good job. You know, they can go after some people and not after others. And one way to try and create some checks there is to have the ability for people who have been harmed to go directly into court. And so that's one of the things that a lot of groups in Latin America are working on, is making that more possible. I think that what we see with these processes of overcoming authoritarianism, and I don't want to be too sanguine about it. It's hard to do this, right? But one of the things that we do see is that you often can't see the opposition until there's a tipping point, right? So there's an awful lot of very quiet, low-level, local discussions that have to happen before you can get to national turning points. And so I think that's the important thing to do now, is to figure out where those very local, very, not necessarily public conversations can be happening. And at some point, there is a tipping point, right? But there has to be a whole lot of preparatory work done for it to work. Well, that's what we know. That's what we can see from other places. And the last thing that I'll say, creativity, imagination, humor, sort of doing things in a way that engages people, right? And frankly, young people are good at this. Older people, not so much. But so this is a call to young people, right? Y'all are good at this. Go do it.
Well, on that note, I want to say a huge thank you for sharing this expertise with us, and for, the all of the writing that you have done on this, which I think really prefigures our ability to understand what's happening right now across the world, but particularly in the US context, as we tried to frame with the kind of opening clips today. And we're going to continue these conversations in the weeks to come. So please come on back. We are here again this same time next week with Michelle Brown and Rebecca Gordon. We're going to be having a conversation that's focused more on the language of war in particular, and also how that is begetting militarization in US urban centers. I'm so grateful for your time, and thank you for being here. And folks can go find the book on fighting grand corruption, and feel free to keep coming back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everybody.